Another speaker that I'm going to introduce right now, Ben Metcalf, the Director of California Housing and Community Development Department. And Mr. Metcalf directs the department responsible for the state's affordable housing loan and grant portfolio, as well as for housing policy development and oversight at both the state and local level. Recent accomplishments include collaborating with the state legislature to secure passage of the landmark 2017 legislative housing package, for which HCD is now implementing key bills that provide more than $250 million annually for affordable housing. Greatly expanded oversight of local zoning and permitting and position HCD as a key technical resources for streamlining construction of new housing. Prior to HCD, Mr. Metcalf worked in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development as Deputy Assistant Secretary for multifamily housing programs. He also previously developed affordable housing at Bridge Housing Corporation, a California-based nonprofit. He earned his BA from Amherst College and his Master of Public Policy and Urban Planning from the Harvard Kennedy School. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Ben Metcalf.
Hello, good morning, and thank you for having me here. And I do apologize for having to rush in and rush out. Today is a big day with housing summits going on around the LA area, and I'm scheduled to get back for another presentation later this afternoon with the Southern California Association of Governments. Let me just start by saying thank you for your focus in the housing area, and all of you, I know, are working very hard in your relative communities and jurisdictions to come to terms with what the statewide affordability crisis is really meaning for the people who live in your communities, and trying to think creatively about ways to step up and be responsive. I think the challenges that we face today really are ones that we've been looking at, staring with, grappling, and in many ways getting worse and worse over a period of decades. And I think I'll just start by saying there are no quick fixes for any of this. And while we need to take a lot of comfort from the great work happening in local communities and the great work happening at the state, it's clearly just a step in the direction that we'll need to go to really turn the tide here to create a community in California that is more equitable and opportunistic for everybody. I'm starting with a photo of the archetypal California family looking pretty glum, with the reality that more than half of their income for maybe 1.5 million California households is going up in smoke every month. The reasons for this, as our statewide housing assessment report that we issued last year show, are largely a chronic lack of supply going back decades. So this is the sort of key data graphic from our report earlier this year, which is a reminder that what has happened over the last several decades has been California has entered into a systemic housing production trough, where we have been building, on average, only about 80,000 homes per year, or about half of what we knew we needed to on an annual basis, just to sort of tread water with the housing affordability crisis. What's interesting about this slide, I think, is it may be encouraging in its own way, is that it doesn't have to be this way. Clearly, there's a historic precedent in California going back to the 20th century where we were able to build much more significantly and extensively and much more in line with what will be needed going forward in the future. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We'll talk about that a little bit. The consequences of that have been particularly profound. This chart looks at the divergence for renters. And as a reminder that as rents have been going up in a historic rate over the last couple of decades, for the typical renter household, incomes have remained largely flat or declined slightly. So it's that double whammy of price appreciation, rent increase growth, paired with stagnant income for the lower income households in California and median income households. And this gets to the 1.5 million worst case housing needs household. This is HUD's definition of the families that are most afflicted by the housing crisis. These are households that don't receive any federal or state rental assistance, are paying more than half their income every month, and therefore the research shows are making incredible sacrifices on savings for retirement, on health care, on education for their kids. The other thing which our report talked quite a bit about is the the question not just of where is the housing getting built, not just the question of if the housing is getting built, but where is the housing getting built? And unfortunately, I think we can say at every geographic level, and this looks by counties, but you could do the same analysis within a county, we tend to see a disproportionate share of the housing that does get built, getting built in places that tends to be a little bit farther away from our infrastructure, a little bit farther away from our jobs, and often in ways that aren't supportive or conducive to the state's climate change goals because they're contributing to vehicle miles traveled out on our roadways. So again, you know, we do have some hope here. It's not all is lost. Clearly, this incredible pain that's being felt out in our communities is translating up into action by folks at the state and local level who are working to correct some of these policy issues. I think for you all, coming at it from the county perspective, when I think about the action that was taken at the state, what's interesting really is the fact that there was an effort to think comprehensively about a solution, that this wasn't just about throwing a little bit of money at the project or trying to come down hard on some particular actor. It's really trying to come up with a whole bunch of incentives, remedies, consequences. And I would argue underlying all of that legislative effort was a conviction that, first of all, we need to have better data so we know what we're actually doing at the county level. And we need to create things like incentives that drive actors to go in the direction that's going to be in the best interest of the state, and then have real consequences when folks don't. So let me just give you a couple examples of how this plays out with the package. There were 15 bills altogether. I think you all will be familiar with many of those bills already, but let me just hit a couple highlights quickly before we get to the substance of the remarks. AB 1397 is a bill that's really trying to increase the zoned capacity of communities in ways that make sure that that zoning is actually buildable land. So through the housing element process, all counties, cities have to identify where they can achieve their regional housing needs allocations. 1397 is trying to be a little bit tighter about making sure that the sites that have been identified are credible sites that can really get built upon. We have an effective date on this bill of January 1st. We're planning to put a TA memo out in the spring. Probably the good news here for you all is that your jurisdictions probably won't have to worry about this until we get all the way into the next RENA cycle, unless you are doing a mid-cycle update, which won't come due until next year, which should be only a small minority of jurisdictions. SB 35 was the other probably bill that got a lot of attention. So this bill, again, the premise here is, you know, if the jurisdiction is delivering on the RENA goals, if they're getting permits that are in line with what the RENA targets are, then this doesn't matter. It's as if SB 35 doesn't exist. But if you're not able to do that, the theory here is that we need to figure out a way to make some of this worthwhile housing happen a little bit faster. So if you're a project that wants to build and on a site where you're in conformance with the local general plan, and it's infill in nature, and you're willing to do a couple of other things, like set aside some of your units for affordable and pay prevailing wage rates, then you'll get this streamlined approval process that allow you to move forward without the local land use authority having any discretion in the matter. Objective criteria, objective design guidelines, all that's fine. But the premise here is the project will have to move forward one way or the other. Here, I think the key thing to know is with the Jan 1 effective date, we'll be working, first of all, to develop a list of the eligible communities where SB 35 can be triggered and get that out by the end of this year, and then working on guidelines next summer. Housing Accountability Act has been strengthened with this package. There are now more legal remedies that developers will have against cities and counties when the actions taken by those cities and counties are unlawful, arbitrary, when cities and counties are making decisions to arbitrarily deny projects when they don't have appropriate health and safety findings, or when the project isn't conforming to local zoning. The consequences of this may be that a jurisdiction has to pay a remedy, and those funds go to a local housing trust fund. It may be that the court will now have a little bit less deference to the position of your city county attorney in terms of making that decision. And overarching all of this on the enforcement side is this authority now that's expressly granted to HCD to, number one, rescind housing element compliance mid-cycle if the city is taking clear and compelling actions that undercut its ability to achieve its RENA goals. And then number two, For really, I think those worst offenders that are out there that just sit there thumbing their nose at existing state law or are taking actions that clearly violate federal fair housing law, there's now a real and meaningful remedy that the state can bring down through the direct involvement of the Attorney General. I don't want to scare people here. That's not my intent. I have no desire in using this remedy. But I think it's important, again, to know there are incentives to do the right thing, and then there are potentially consequences if you're really going the wrong direction. And then the other big piece of this package, obviously, is the funding. SB 2 provides planning grants to local jurisdictions to help them get their grants up to date in the first year, as well as homeless programs. In the out years, provides most of the money to local governments, only a minority to state governments. For the planning grants and the local government funds, those are largely going to be flexible dollars that the localities will get to determine how to use. And we expect about $250 million altogether to flow in the first year, but that will determine. Fees won't start getting collected until January. We don't expect to have our first slug of funds appropriated to go out to jurisdictions until later in the year. And there's a lot of work that'll have to get done between now and then to figure out exactly the mechanism for all these dollars. And then SB 3 was moved by the legislature onto the ballot for November. $4 billion of funds through a whole bunch of different programs listed up here on the board that will help communities to deliver on their affordable housing and infrastructure goals, farm worker, home ownership, the full gamut, veterans home loans. I think what's interesting here, and there's a little bit of the timing here, and here's our happy family. Lots of happy families. I think what's interesting on the funding side is, again, it all connects back around. So embedded into the SB 2 local housing dollars, embedded into many of the future SB 3 programs, will be these stipulations that jurisdictions have to be in compliance with their housing element. They have to be doing their annual reporting. So I think we're moving into this new normal where there is a higher level of expectation that if jurisdictions want to be able to access these kinds of funds, and by the way, some of the cap and trade dollars will also have these same characteristics. Our SB 1 planning grants also require current annual reporting, that we've got to have the data. People have got to report actually what's going on. If there's a problem and we want to do good policy, we need to know what's happening. And that cities and counties need to make sure that they're at least complying with state housing law and have a certified housing element. So with those things in place, the funds then can flow to these communities. So it is an attempt, I think, I would argue, to kind of bring it all together in a meaningful and comprehensive way. But it's clearly not the full solution either. It's a step in the right direction, we think, for helping solve the housing issues. So with that, I'll stop and take some questions.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I'll start off with one question. The recent tax bill that was introduced by the House eliminates the 4% low-income housing tax credit, and it provides about $2 billion a year California for low-income housing. The bill also eliminates tax reductions for certain municipal financings that support affordable housing development. So what is California doing to preserve these programs, and could the affordable housing program survive if these provisions went into force?
Yeah, actually I think as we speak there's a press event going on down in San Diego with the state treasurer and folks from my office saying basically, as the governor has already said, this tax plan just doesn't work. It doesn't work for California on many levels. But for affordable housing, you're right, it would be devastating. The large majority of funding for affordable housing projects in California rely on the 4% and tax-exempt bond structure. All of the state programs that I just described rely on that 4% and tax-exempt bond structure. To put it in context, I think we have about maybe 20,000 affordable housing units that get built in a typical year in California, and about 3/4 of those rely on that 4% and tax-exempt bond structure. So you're looking at, some estimates have said, as many as 300,000 fewer affordable units that get built in California over the next 10 years, and significantly higher expenditures on a per unit basis, maybe as much as another $125,000 per unit that the state would have to invest to make that same project go forward without that federal resource being there. Now, we're, I think, on pins and needles waiting for the Senate chair of the Finance Committee to release his tax plan. It's expected within a few hours. I think the initial rumors, at least, are that the tax-exempt bond and 4% credit will be preserved. I think California will take a hit on the state and local tax deduction side, so it's it's going to be a little bit of a mixed bag, but I am encouraged by what I'm hearing out of Washington right now that there may be a different version of this in the Senate that will give us some hope. But clearly a lot of advocacy is still needed for us to prevail on this one.
Thank you. Any questions from our audience? Bruce.
Yeah. There we go. I think that works. Hi, Bruce Gibson from San Luis Obispo County.
Hi,
And
good morning.
when we talk about housing affordability, the first thing we hear usually is about the number of units that haven't been built in recent years, the question of the supply side.
Yeah.
And there are those who think that there's a supply side solution to this. But, you know, as a matter of public policy, if I were, you know, I am a county supervisor, and I'm going to advocate for policy that says we're going to drive everybody's home prices down by flooding the market with more supply, it causes me some uncertainty. In fact, I'm dubious that a supply side solution by itself works. I was wondering if HCD has looked at the economics of supply and demand on housing and has any idea of how much you think there is a market solution on the supply side as opposed to the creation of deed-restricted affordable housing, which seems to be the thrust of a lot of the recent state public policy.
Yeah. So our economic analysis is that the state needs to be producing about 180,000 new units a year, or about double what we've done historically, to tread water. So just to prevent the significant increases in rents and significant price appreciation for homes above inflation. There is another study that was done recently by McKinsey Global, which asked the question, what would it take to normalize California's housing market in line with typical housing affordability nationwide? Their number was you'd need to put 3.5 million new homes into California over the next 10 years, or almost double what we're projecting to actually begin to lower that down. That's a big challenge. That's not easily attained, but it's a pretty audacious goal for sure. And then to your second point, clearly we can do all that. We can build ourselves crazy, and there's still going to be our most vulnerable residents, our single moms with kids, our homeless individuals, our vets who won't be able to benefit from
Median household incomes. That's the one, you know, in my county, median household can afford $325,000 home, and the median price is more like $570. So, I mean, to me, it cuts a significant portion of the population that's going to be counted.
I mean, I think, again, if you look historically at California, we didn't have that problem. In the 70s and 80s, a median household could buy. So I think it's possible to get there with enough supply. But for the time being, I think as a policymaker, we need to really focus on that very vulnerable sets of populations that are just priced out permanently because they're stuck on a minimum wage job, or they're coming out of homeless, or they're a vet coming back from combat. So I think there is a two-pronged solution, and it's both subsidy and trying to figure out how to make the market work better.
Any other questions?
Let me actually add on to that, because I know we're also here to talk about workforce housing. I mean, I think there's also a lot of room for creativity around trying to get housing built at a lower price point in areas like micro units. We haven't talked about accessory dwelling units, but we think there's a lot of upward potential there. These smaller, more efficient, some of these homes getting now built using factory-built modular construction, where we can lower the price point, get more units, have a better entry-level product for our aging boomers, for our workforce housing folks, without taking $1 of public subsidy. That also has to be part of the solution for your median family.
Other questions?
If I may, Supervisor Forster,
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Director
Yes.
Metcalf. A great presentation. Thank you for being here. During the course of the debate in the legislature the last few years over a permanent source of affordable housing and streamlining the local development process, there's been a lot of focus on local developer impact fees and how they're too high, and localities should waive them, reduce them, delay them to help offset the upfront cost of housing. There's talk about regionalizing the requirement to sort of maintain and upkeep infrastructure so that it's not on the new homeowner. Can you share some thoughts with us on that? Because from a local government perspective, it's challenging as a policy advocate, because what if we are going to reduce, waive, delay fees, how does that infrastructure get built and maintained?
Great question. That was something that has come up again and again. It was in the mix as part of, a lot of interest in doing something on that as part of the state legislative package. I think it turns out to be really complicated for the reasons you're alluding, Kiana, which is when you start to pull one string over here and unravel some other strings over there, ultimately where the legislature landed in the package was actually direction to my department, HCD, to undertake a study on this. So we will be starting next summer working with a third-party firm, an analysis of options and a study of actually what's happening in practice. I think we don't have enough information and we don't understand the consequences of any changes. I think clearly people can and do point to excessive impact fees that just don't make sense, where it is just $120,000, $150,000 per door. It's clearly depressing supply. There's got to be a better way, but I don't have the answer. We need to do that work, and that's not an easy one, and will take help from a lot of different parties. Yeah.
I've read that millennials are not purchasing homes at the rate or that we have seen historically and don't have a strong desire, generally speaking, to be homeowners. Is that a trend that we're seeing flesh out in the housing market? And how should we think about then, housing needs and demands? Are they essentially the same as people still need to live somewhere? But how do you see those trends impacting the larger supply and demand and, the housing situation moving forward?
Great question. I believe the homeownership rate in California today is at its lowest level since we came out of World War II. We've seen a huge shift over the last few years. A lot of that shift has actually taken place within our single-family home segment in California. So what we saw during the financial crisis was this unparalleled wave of foreclosures that ravaged communities and took folks out of their homes. And in many cases, what happened is the folks buying those homes were institutional investors who were then repositioning those homes as rental opportunities. I think that was actually helpful. It created some space for folks who had tarnished credit. They didn't have a down payment. It allowed us to keep those homes in play. I think it's an open question as folks begin to repair their credit and rebuild their equity, whether we see those rates go up. At this point, I wouldn't say it's sort of good, neither good nor bad, except perhaps it means that we see a little bit more transience in the rental community than we do in the homeownership community.
Hey, Ben, do you mind if I jump in on that question real
Yeah,
quick?
please.
Just say, the numbers that we look at the national level don't see that trends. I mean, I think that the trends are that the millennial generation are buying homes later, but the propensity and the desire to own a home is no different than prior generations. They're just having to put that off, whether it's student loans, their careers haven't got off to a very good start or slower start than they wanted, so they don't have the income to pay off those loans or be able to afford the housing. And they're waiting a little longer to get married, to have kids. Most of the survey data shows that the desire is not having any different. It's just the ability to has been different than in prior generations, and that's what's kind of put off some of those decisions for. Traditionally, people 25 to 30 would get a house, and now it's more like 30 to 35. And so it's just kind of been pushed out a little farther down in the age cycle.
Any other questions? I'll throw one more at you before you have to leave, but
Yeah.
I'm going to ask it of my panel later. I was at the California Economic Summit last week in San Diego, and it seems to be a three-part equation to solve the problem, especially in Southern California. The creation of more housing, creation of more jobs, and water supply. But with the twin tunnels running into, it looks like a brick wall now, and may not happen, what impact do you think that's going to have on housing, especially in the southern part of the state?
Yeah, I worry quite a bit about that because water availability is a condition precedent for new applications and approval of projects. So I do see a scenario whereby we are unable to catch up with the housing backlog because we're unable to build in the communities that need the water. I think we are making great strides in terms of in the residential sector in terms of water conservation. So one of the things that is going to become more critical than ever is going back and retrofitting our existing housing stock to lower the water profile there, water saving and conservation, really trying to take out a lot of those traditional Southern California green grass suburban lawns and replace them with water resistant. So, I mean, I think we're going to have to, we're looking at a future where we're going to have to get a lot more creative about making our existing stock more efficient to create the headroom where we can build new stock. I don't see how else we do it.
All right. Thank you. One more question over here.
Thank you. How do you see the housing sector in relationship to California's focus on having a more greener grid, renewable generation, and the increased growth of housing, multifamily dwellings, and meeting that demand in the energy sector with, more sustainable communities, as well as, the transportation electrification initiatives to reduce greenhouse gases? Do you see the more emphasis on energy efficiency and more Title 24 and above structures being built?
Actually, no. I don't. I mean, I actually don't think we have that much. And I think the analysis will suggest that when you look at how we're going to hit our climate change goals, you're getting a pretty small increment at this point by increased energy efficiency for new construction. There's certainly space in the retrofit of the existing stock, but we're getting a pretty high degree of efficiency now out of our new built product. When our Council of Governments have been working with the California Air Resources Board to try and sort of problem solve out how we hit our state's targets, the primary space that they're looking at right now is density. It is actually trying to build more housing units closer to our transit and job areas, because the far and away the biggest driver for energy consumption and for our GHG goals is the question of vehicle miles traveled. And so I think the overwhelming strategy is really thinking about how do we operationalize these sustainable community strategies that the COGs have put in place, and really make sure that we're aligning our SB1 investments, our cap and trade investments, and our housing investments all on those same corridors. So we're getting people closer to their jobs and we're lowering the vehicle miles traveled. The moment you start lowering those vehicle miles traveled, you have all kinds of secondary effects that are really beneficial to energy, reducing our energy consumption, energy profile. That's easier said than done, but I'm telling you, that's the only way we get there for climate change. And I think that is the challenge all of the COGs are working with right now is we've got these great SESs on paper, but how do we actually translate them into, number one, conforming general plans, and number two, actually then see the housing getting built in the places and the ways that we envision that happening.
All right, any further questions? Well, Mr. Metcalf, thank you very much for being here today, and we appreciate all the work you're doing on behalf of affordable housing and the citizens of the state.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you to all of you, because I know many of the counties have really been innovating in this space. I was just talking about work going on in Nevada County on speeding up their permitting desk, and I was out meeting with folks in Merced County on ways they're taking surplus public lands and converting it, out. Everywhere you go, you see a lot of innovation coming from the county sector. And so all this work we do in the state is all fine and well, but if we don't have the counties in particular taking the lead on a lot of this stuff, we're just never going to get there with our collective goals. So thank you for your leadership. And please let me know if I can be a resource. I know, particularly with these bills, there are a lot of questions that keep coming up, and some of it may be surfacing to you. I'm a resource. Please reach out through CSAC with any questions. We will be getting out a list of frequently asked questions up on our website, as well as a schedule. Information on all the bills will be on our website as well. So you have the information here on how you can get you and your staff plugged in with our resources. Please take advantage of that. Thank you.